A possible Raiders push for Justin Jefferson already sounds like the kind of move that makes Raider Nation stop scrolling. But that is only where this whole thing starts getting uncomfortable. Because behind that superstar rumor, there is a contract situation with an unhappy All-Pro that could quietly reshape the secondary, a 3-team trade idea that would force fans to ask a painful question about the soul of this defense, and a rookie gaining enough belief that one starting job might not be as safe as people thought. There are certain names in the NFL that still feel almost impossible when you connect them to the Raiders. You hear the rumor, you pause, you almost laugh, and then that dangerous little part of your brain starts whispering, "Hold on, what if?" And that is exactly where this first story lives. Because the conversation around Minnesota's quarterback situation is starting to open a door that right now is barely cracked. But if things go sideways up there, the Raiders could be standing right in front of it. The name being connected to Las Vegas is Justin Jefferson, and yeah, I know how that sounds. At first, it feels like fantasy football, but the quarterback uncertainty in Minnesota is what makes people stop laughing. CBS Sports' Garrett Podell floated the Raiders as a logical landing spot if Jefferson eventually becomes unhappy with how things are going with the Vikings, and once you step back from the shock, the reasoning is not hard to follow. Minnesota is entering a strange quarterback era. They appear ready to move forward with J.J. McCarthy and Kyler Murray involved in that picture, and while both guys have upside, neither one is a clean, no-doubt elite answer. And when you have a receiver like Jefferson, a player who has already been first-team All-Pro, already been Offensive Player of the Year, already proven he can dominate the league, patience starts to run thin if the quarterback position keeps feeling unstable. That is where the Raiders become interesting. Because if Fernando Mendoza really becomes what this organization hopes he can be after going first overall in 2026, John Spytek is eventually going to face a serious question. Do you slowly build around him and hope the wide receiver room grows naturally? Or do you do what this franchise has done before and swing for the kind of weapon that changes the way defenses sleep at night? We have seen this movie before with Davante Adams. The Raiders traded premium picks because they believed pairing an elite receiver with their offensive core could speed up the path to contention. It did not end the way anybody wanted emotionally, and Raider fans still carry some of that scar tissue, but the logic behind the swing was real. Now imagine a Klint Kubiak offense with Mendoza, Brock Bowers, Ashton, Jeanty, and Jefferson forcing defenses to pick their poison every snap. That is not just adding a receiver. That is changing the math of every Sunday. Suddenly Bowers gets cleaner space. Jeanty sees lighter boxes. Mendoza gets a true separator who can win when the play breaks. That is how young quarterbacks grow up fast in this league. But the hard part is obvious. Jefferson would have to actually want out. Minnesota would have to even entertain the idea. And his contract situation would matter because he is heading toward the final year of that 4-year, $140 million deal in 2028. So this would take picks, money, timing, and the kind of organizational conviction that can either build a contender or bury a front office. Podell suggested a possible price of a first and a third, and if that is anywhere close to reality, you better believe the Raiders would at least have the conversation. But the real tension is this. Would Las Vegas be ready to go all in at exactly the moment Mendoza needs help most? Because if the Vikings stumble, if Jefferson starts looking around, and if the Raiders are sitting there with a young quarterback ready for a superstar, that quiet little rumor could become the kind of decision that defines an entire era. Now, the second story does not come with the same headline shock, but honestly, this is the kind of thing that can mess with a locker room if it sits too long. Everybody loves talking about superstar trades and offensive fireworks, but winning teams also have to handle the uncomfortable business in the middle of the roster. And right now, the Raiders have one of those situations with a veteran defensive back who came in with a real role waiting for him, but also came in wanting more security than his contract currently gives him. That player is Taron Johnson, and this one is tricky. The Raiders brought him over from Buffalo for a late-round pick swap, so it was not some expensive, franchise-shaking investment. But do not let the trade price fool you. Johnson has been an all-pro before. He has played meaningful football. He knows what real defensive communication is supposed to sound like. And for a Raiders secondary that has been young, inconsistent, and honestly way too easy to attack at times, having that kind of veteran presence in the slot matters. Then he skipped the voluntary portion of OTAs before showing up for mandatory work. and everybody knew what that meant. This was about money. Right now, he has only a small guaranteed amount on his 2026 base salary, and nothing guaranteed for 2027. So from his perspective, he is looking at a team that wants him to play an important role, take hits in the slot, help stabilize young defensive backs, and maybe mentor the room, but without fully committing to him beyond the immediate future. I understand why that bothers him, but I also understand why the Raiders are not rushing. Johnson turns 30 soon. He has been banged up. He has not played at that all-pro level since 2023. And John Spytek did not inherit this roster just to start handing out guarantees based on old reputation. That is where the business side gets cold. ESPN's Ryan McFadden predicted the best-case scenario would be a reworked deal with extra guarantees, and honestly, that feels like the most realistic middle ground. Not a massive new contract, not some emotional overpay, just enough security to get the player fully bought in and keep the defense from creating another unnecessary distraction. But here is the pressure point. Treydan Stukes is sitting right there. The Raiders used a second-round pick on him, and even though he is listed as a safety, there is real belief he can handle slot responsibilities. That changes the entire conversation. Johnson wants security, but the Raiders are treating this like a prove-it situation, and if this thing gets ugly, Las Vegas can look at Stukes and say, "We drafted our future already." Still, that does not mean cutting Johnson loose is the smartest move. Young defensive backs need veterans who have seen route combinations, motion tricks, playoff-level quarterbacks, and all those little things that do not show up in a combine report. If Johnson comes into training camp locked in, healthy, vocal, and willing to lead, the Raiders could absolutely reward that. But he has to prove it inside this building first. Not in Buffalo, not on an old all-pro resume. Here in the silver and black. And that is what makes this situation feel like a quiet standoff. Nobody is screaming publicly, nobody is burning bridges. But there is a decision coming, and the way Johnson handles camp could decide whether this becomes a smart veteran reset or the first real sign that the depth chart is already starting to move without him. The third story is the one that makes me sit back and stare at the wall for a second, because I do not care how many times people float these ideas. Hearing Maxx Crosby's name in a trade scenario still feels wrong. It feels like somebody walking into your house and suggesting you remove the foundation because the roof might need work later. That is what this is emotionally for Raiders fans. Maxx is not just another edge rusher. He is the heartbeat. He is the tone setter. He is the guy who has carried losing seasons with a face full of blood, a motor that never shuts off, and a loyalty to the shield that fans do not take lightly. So when Bleacher Report's Christopher Knox proposed a 3-team trade involving the Cowboys and Titans, I get the logic on paper, but emotionally, man, it is hard to even let the sentence breathe. The proposed deal would send Crosby and Calvin Ridley to Dallas, George Pickens to Tennessee, and the Raiders would receive Dallas's 2027 first-round pick, Dallas's 2027 fifth-round pick, Tennessee's 2027 second-round pick, and young wide receiver Elic Ayomanor. That is a lot of moving parts, and none of them make the central piece feel any easier to swallow. The reason this is even being discussed is because the earlier trade noise around Crosby has gone quieter but not fully disappeared. The report mentions that the Raiders had agreed to send him to Baltimore earlier in the offseason before medical concerns came up during his physical and the Ravens backed away. Now, once he can pass a physical, the idea is that teams could start circling again. But let me be honest, as a Raiders fan, I hate the idea of measuring Maxx Crosby in draft slots, because there are players who produce and then there are players who define what your team is supposed to feel like. Crosby is the second kind. Still, this is where John Spytek has to live in a world fans do not always want to live in. If the front office believes the timeline is shifting around Fernando, Mendoza, Brock Bowers, Ashton, Jeanty, and a younger offensive core, they might look at a major return and say, we need assets. That is the cold, brutal part of roster building. And this proposed package is not nothing. A first-rounder from Dallas, a fifth, a second from Tennessee that could be early if the Titans struggle, plus Ayomanor, who is only 23 and showed promise as a rookie. That gives the Raiders future ammunition and a young receiver with upside. The Cowboys would be chasing a pass-rushing monster and another receiver. Tennessee would flip into a new receiving trio with Pickens, Wan'Dale Robinson, and Carnell Tate around Cam Ward. For those teams, you can see the appeal. Dallas gets aggressive. Tennessee gets a long-term weapon. But for Las Vegas, the question is heavier than compensation. What message do you send when you move the one player who has embodied your defensive identity through all the chaos? Are you telling fans the timeline matters more than the soul of the defense, or are you making the painful, calculated move that eventually gives Mendoza the roster help he needs? That is the part that makes this whole thing dangerous, because if you trade Crosby for anything less than a king's ransom, Raider Nation is not just going to debate it, they are going to feel it deep. And even if the draft picks turn into good players later, Sundays without Maxx flying off the edge would feel like a different team wearing familiar colors. So yeah, the deal might make sense in a spreadsheet, but inside the chest of this fan base, that decision would not be judged years later. It would hit the second it happened. The final story brings everything back to the field, and honestly, this might be the most important kind of development because it is not built on fantasy trades or contract tension. This is about a young player walking into the building and making people believe. Not because he is loud, not because he is acting like the job belongs to him, but because the more you listen to what people around the Raiders are saying, the more it feels like this rookie has a real chance to force the coaching staff into a decision. The player is Treydan Stukes, and the buzz around him is starting to feel serious. The Raiders took him in the second round at number 38 after a strong career at Arizona, where he put up 206 tackles, 35 passes defended, and 7 interceptions. That is production. That is not just a workout warrior resume. And yes, he runs a 4.33 40, which immediately makes old-school Raiders fans raise an eyebrow because we know this franchise's history with speed. For years, the Raiders loved fast players and sometimes hoped the football part would catch up later. But Stukes feels different. He has the speed, but he also has the composure and intelligence to understand exactly where he is and exactly what he has to earn. Brandon Yeargan, the Raiders' director of college scouting, even called Stukes one of his favorite interviews of all time, praising how down-to-earth and comfortable he was, along with what he described as rare intelligence. That matters. Because when a rookie comes into an NFL defensive backroom, talent gets him noticed, but maturity keeps him alive. Stukes has to communicate, handle motion, process route combinations, and take coaching without ego, especially if he wants to play early. And from everything he has said, he sounds like a guy ready to be a sponge. He talked about learning from veterans, asking questions, getting in everybody's ear, and not pretending he knows more than people who have already lived this league. That is exactly what you want to hear from a rookie who also has the athletic ability to challenge for snaps immediately. And this connects directly back to the Taron Johnson situation. If Johnson is happy, healthy, and locked in, maybe Stukes gets to settle at safety, grow naturally, and become part of a more complete secondary. But if that veteran contract situation lingers, or if Johnson does not look like the answer in camp, the Raiders have a young option who can step into the slot conversation right away. That versatility is valuable because this secondary needed help badly. Eric Stokes was described as the only consistent corner last year, and that tells you everything about why Spytek attacked the defensive backfield. Opposing quarterbacks had too much comfort. Even with Crosby rushing, teams still found ways to pick apart the back end. That is demoralizing. Nothing drains a defense like watching the pass rush fight like crazy, only for the ball to come out into open windows again and again. So Stukes is not just battling for a job. He is walking into a unit that desperately needs somebody to change the feel. And what I like most is that he is not talking like a savior. He said he is easy to get along with, not a guy who does a lot of barking, just someone who will go through his process and earn respect. That is Raider football when it is done right. Work, edge, confidence with humility underneath it. Training camp will tell the truth because pads have a way of exposing everybody. But right now, the community is getting more bullish for a reason. Stukes has the traits, the production, the mentality, and the opportunity. And if he keeps stacking days, the Raiders may not be easing him into the future for very long. They may be watching him pull it closer, one rep at a time. So now Raider Nation is staring at 4 very different emotions at once. The dream of Justin Jefferson, the business tension with Taron Johnson, the terrifying thought of a Maxx Crosby trade, and the rising belief that Treydan Stukes might be ready right now. That is the NFL. Hope, fear, loyalty, and pressure all smashing together before the season even gets here. But this is where the silver and black have to be sharp. No panic, no soft decisions, no half-built vision. Tell me what you believe in the comments, because this roster feels like it is standing at a real crossroads. And around here, the standard never changes. Just win, baby.